Your business will never become what you think it will be. Those were the words my wife said while looking at the documents I had spent months preparing, and I still remember the silence that followed. I did not argue. I did not try to convince her. I simply closed my laptop and quietly accepted that sometimes people only believe what they can see. My name is Ethan Walker, and for most of my life, I have learned that success does not always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly, away from attention, while everyone around you assumes nothing is happening. To the outside world, my company looked small. I worked from a modest office, had a limited team, and avoided the kind of publicity that many entrepreneurs chased. But what people did not know was that my business was built on solving problems most people never noticed. I helped companies understand complicated challenges, improve their operations, and make better decisions. I did not have a flashy headquarters or a public image that made people stop and stare. I had something different. I had experience. My wife, Claire Walker, saw success in another way. She was a respected executive at a major corporation, and I admired everything she had achieved. She worked hard, built an impressive career, and earned the respect of many people in her industry. But over time, our definitions of success became different. Claire believed growth should be obvious. She believed success should come with a bigger office, a recognizable title, and numbers that everyone could see. I believed success was about creating something valuable, even if most people never knew your name. For years, that difference never seemed important. We supported each other in our own ways. But when my company started preparing for its next stage of growth, I thought Claire would understand why it mattered to me. Instead, she looked at my plans and saw uncertainty. She saw risk. She saw a dream that might never become reality. "Ethan, you have to be realistic," she told me. "You cannot keep believing this small business will suddenly become something bigger." Her words were not meant to hurt me. I knew that. She was speaking from her own experiences and the world she understood. But hearing those words from the person closest to me still felt different. I wondered if maybe I had failed to explain myself. Maybe I had spent so much time working quietly that even the people closest to me never saw what I was building. That night, I reviewed my company plans again. I looked at the progress we had made, the clients we had helped, and the opportunities ahead. I knew the journey would not be easy. No meaningful achievement ever was. But I also knew something Claire did not. My business was not struggling. It was preparing for a moment nobody expected. The next morning, while I was reviewing new information from one of my clients, my phone rang. The person on the other end introduced himself as Richard Hayes, the CEO of one of the largest companies connected to Claire's industry. His voice sounded serious, and his first question immediately caught my attention. "Mr. Walker, we need someone who can see what our team has missed. Can you help us?" At that moment, I realized something important. The people who underestimated me had only seen one chapter of my story. They had no idea what was about to happen next. After the unexpected phone call from Richard Hayes, I sat quietly for a moment and looked at my office around me. The same room where I had spent countless hours building my company suddenly felt different. Nothing had physically changed, but I knew I was standing at the beginning of a moment that could change everything. Richard was the CEO of a major corporation, someone who had access to teams of experienced professionals, yet he was reaching out to me because something inside his organization needed a different perspective. He explained that his company had been facing a complex challenge for several months. They had talented employees, advanced systems, and experienced consultants, but the results were not matching their expectations. They needed someone who could look at the situation from a different angle. I listened carefully and asked questions before giving any opinion. That was something I had always believed in. The fastest person to speak was not always the person with the best answer. Sometimes the most important details were hidden in the things people overlooked. After our conversation, I agreed to review the information they provided. I did not see it as a chance to prove Claire wrong. I did not see it as an opportunity to show people they had underestimated me. I saw it as another problem that needed to be solved. That mindset had guided me throughout my career. When I first started my company, many people told me I was taking an unnecessary risk. They looked at the size of my operation and assumed I could not compete with larger firms. What they did not understand was that I was not trying to compete by being the biggest. I was focused on being the most effective. I built relationships by listening, analyzing, and finding solutions that created real value. The following morning, I reviewed the documents Richard's team had sent. I studied their reports, customer feedback, and internal information. The more I looked, the more I noticed patterns that others had missed. The issue was not that the company lacked talented people. The issue was that different parts of the organization were working toward different goals. Each team was trying to succeed, but they were not always moving in the same direction. I prepared my notes and scheduled a meeting with Richard and his leadership team. Before leaving, I thought about Claire. I wondered if she knew what was happening. I wondered if she would believe me if I told her that a major CEO had asked for my help. But I decided not to say anything yet. I did not want to create another argument. I wanted actions to speak louder than explanations. When I arrived at Richard's company headquarters, the difference between my small office and their impressive building was obvious. The lobby was filled with employees, large displays, and signs of corporate success. But I reminded myself that appearances were not the reason I was there. Problems existed everywhere, regardless of the size of a company. Inside the conference room, Richard introduced me to his leadership team. Some people looked curious. Others looked uncertain. They were used to working with large consulting firms and executives with impressive titles. I understood their hesitation. They did not know my story. They only saw what was in front of them. I opened my notebook and began asking questions. Slowly, the room became quieter. The executives started realizing that I was not there to criticize their work. I was there to understand it. And as I listened to their answers, I discovered something that would change the entire situation. The problem they had been trying to solve was not the real problem at all. The first meeting with Richard Hayes and his leadership team lasted several hours, but I could tell within the first few minutes that the company was dealing with a problem deeper than what appeared on their reports. Everyone in the room was intelligent and experienced. They had spent months studying the situation, reviewing numbers, and trying different approaches. The challenge was not a lack of effort. The challenge was that everyone was looking at the same issue from the same direction. I started by asking simple questions. I wanted to understand how different departments communicated, how decisions were made, and how information moved through the organization. Some executives seemed surprised because they expected me to arrive with immediate answers. But I had learned something important over the years. The best solutions rarely come from the person who speaks the fastest. They come from the person who takes the time to understand the full picture. As the discussion continued, I noticed several small details that connected together. The company had created strong teams, but those teams were not always connected. One department was making decisions based on customer needs, while another was focused only on internal goals. Each group was doing what they believed was right, but the company as a whole was moving without a unified direction. I explained my observations carefully. I did not blame anyone for the situation because I knew that problems inside successful companies rarely come from one person making one mistake. They usually develop slowly through a series of decisions that seem reasonable at the time. Richard listened closely and asked me what I believed the company needed most. I told him that before making major changes, they needed to rebuild alignment. Every person in the organization needed to understand the same goals and recognize how their work contributed to the larger mission. The room became quiet as the executives considered the idea. One of them asked why previous consultants had not identified the same issue. I explained that sometimes outside perspectives reveal things that become invisible to people who work inside a system every day. It was not about being smarter. It was about seeing the situation without the same assumptions. Later that afternoon, Richard walked with me through the company offices. He showed me different departments and introduced me to employees. I noticed something interesting. The company had talented people everywhere. They had dedication, creativity, and experience. The missing piece was connection. Richard admitted that he had focused so much on growth that he had not noticed how difficult it had become for different teams to move together. I told him that recognizing the problem was already a major step forward. Many companies fail because they refuse to accept that something needs to change. On my way home that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. I remembered Claire telling me that my business would fail because she only saw the size of my company, not the value of my work. I understood why she felt that way. People often judge what they can see. They rarely imagine what exists beneath the surface. The next day, I received another call from Richard. His voice sounded different this time. There was more confidence and trust behind his words. He told me that after reviewing my notes, his team had already started seeing the situation differently. Then he asked me a question I did not expect. He wanted to know if I would take a larger role in helping them rebuild their strategy. I looked at the message on my phone and smiled. Not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because I knew something important had happened. The person everyone overlooked was finally being asked to solve the problem everyone else had missed. When Richard Hayes asked me to take a larger role in helping his company, I knew the decision required careful thought. I had spent years building my own business, creating solutions quietly, and developing relationships based on trust. Suddenly, I was being invited into a much larger environment where every decision carried more attention and responsibility. But I also knew something important. The size of a company does not determine the size of its problems. A small business and a large corporation can both struggle when people lose sight of the bigger picture. I agreed to continue working with Richard and his leadership team because I believed the company had something worth protecting. They had talented employees, loyal customers, and strong potential. They did not need someone to completely change who they were. They needed someone to help them reconnect with what already made them successful. Over the next several days, I spent time with different teams throughout the company. I listened to employees, reviewed their processes, and observed how decisions moved from one department to another. What I discovered confirmed my original thoughts. The company did not have a talent problem. It had a connection problem. People were working hard, but they were not always working together. I presented my findings during a leadership meeting with Richard and his executives. I explained that the company had been trying to fix individual symptoms instead of addressing the larger issue. They were creating new plans every time a challenge appeared, but they were not improving the system that created those challenges. Richard asked me what the first step should be. I told him the company needed clarity. Every department needed to understand the same priorities, and every leader needed to communicate those priorities consistently. Without alignment, even the best strategies could fail. The executives discussed the idea carefully. Some of them admitted that they had become so focused on their own responsibilities that they rarely considered how their choices affected other teams. That realization changed the tone of the meeting. It was no longer about finding someone to blame. It became about finding a better way forward. During that week, I noticed something else changing. People who were initially uncertain about my involvement started asking more questions. They stopped seeing me as an outsider and began seeing me as someone who wanted the company to succeed. That was always my goal. I never believed that helping others required making them feel like they had failed. The best solutions come when people feel respected enough to recognize what needs improvement. At home, Claire noticed that something had changed. She saw me receiving calls from Richard and spending more time reviewing business information. She asked what was happening, and for the first time, I explained everything. I told her about the company, the challenges they faced, and the work I was doing to help. She listened quietly. I could see that she was processing information she had never considered before. She remembered the way she had looked at my business and the assumptions she had made. She realized that she had measured my success using a standard that did not fit my journey. I did not tell her that I had been right all along. I did not need to. The truth was becoming clear through actions, not arguments. The next morning, Richard called with an update. His leadership team had started implementing the changes we discussed, and the early results were encouraging. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me that my perspective had changed the way they viewed their entire organization. At that moment, I understood that the biggest transformation was not just happening inside the company. It was changing the way people saw possibilities they had overlooked for years. The changes inside Richard Hayes' company continued to develop, but what surprised everyone was how quickly people began responding to a different way of thinking. The goal was never to create a sudden transformation that looked impressive from the outside. Real improvement required patience, consistency, and a willingness to understand the reasons behind existing problems. That was something I had learned throughout my career. A company was not just made of numbers, reports, and strategies. It was made of people, and people needed clarity before they could create meaningful results. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Richard and his leadership team. We focused on improving communication between departments, creating clearer priorities, and helping employees understand how their individual responsibilities connected to the company's larger mission. The changes were not complicated. In fact, many of the solutions were simple. The difficult part was recognizing them. Sometimes the biggest obstacles are not hidden because they are impossible to find. They are hidden because everyone becomes too familiar with them. During one leadership meeting, Richard shared updated results with his team. Several areas of the company were already showing improvement. Employees were collaborating more effectively, decisions were being made with better information, and different departments were finally moving in the same direction. The executives who had once been uncertain about my approach started asking deeper questions. They were no longer asking whether my ideas could work. They were asking how they could continue building on them. That was the moment I knew the real change had started. Later that afternoon, Richard and I walked through the company headquarters. He thanked me for helping his team see things differently. I told him that the credit belonged to everyone who was willing to listen and make adjustments. I never believed one person could save a company alone. A strong leader does not create success by having all the answers. A strong leader creates success by helping others discover better answers together. When I returned home that evening, Claire was waiting for me. She had been following the changes at the company and wanted to talk. For the first time in a long while, the conversation between us felt completely different. There was no disagreement. There was no need for either of us to defend our choices. She simply wanted to understand. Claire admitted that she had spent years believing my business was small because I was not ambitious enough. She said she had confused my quiet personality with a lack of confidence. She realized that I had never been chasing the same things she was chasing. I had been building something based on my own values. I listened carefully because I knew this conversation was important. I told her that I never needed her to see success exactly the way I did. I only wanted her to understand that different paths could lead to meaningful results. Claire looked at me and said she wished she had recognized that sooner. She admitted that she had focused so much on visible achievements that she missed the effort happening behind the scenes. Her words meant something to me, not because I needed an apology, but because they showed that she was finally seeing the person she had overlooked. The next day, Richard invited me to a private meeting. He had reviewed the progress made by his team and wanted to discuss a long-term partnership. He told me that my perspective had brought value far beyond solving one business challenge. I accepted the opportunity, but I remembered something important. The greatest reward was not the recognition from a CEO or the attention from a larger company. The greatest reward was knowing that the work I had quietly built for years finally had the chance to speak for itself. The partnership with Richard Hayes marked a new chapter, but the most meaningful changes were not happening inside the company alone. They were happening in the way people viewed themselves and each other. For years, I had been comfortable working quietly behind the scenes. I never believed that recognition was the purpose of success. I believed the purpose was creating something valuable, helping people solve problems, and building relationships based on trust. But this experience reminded me that sometimes people need to see the results before they understand the journey that created them. At Richard's company, the progress continued. The leadership team became more connected, employees felt more involved in important decisions, and the company developed a stronger sense of direction. Richard often asked for my opinion during strategic discussions, not because he expected me to have every answer, but because he valued the way I approached challenges. I looked at problems differently. I did not start by asking what was going wrong. I started by asking why it happened and what could be improved. One afternoon, Richard invited me to a meeting with several executives to discuss the future of the company. He explained that the organization wanted to expand, but they wanted to do it carefully. They did not want growth that created new problems. They wanted growth built on a strong foundation. I shared my thoughts about maintaining company culture, investing in employees, and making decisions that would create long-term value. The executives listened closely, and I noticed something important. The same people who once questioned whether my ideas belonged in the room were now actively seeking my perspective. But I did not feel the need to remind them of the past. I had no interest in proving that they were wrong. I was focused on helping them move forward. That evening, Claire and I sat together and talked about everything that had happened. She told me she had been thinking about the past several weeks and about the way she had viewed my work. She admitted that she had judged my company based on appearances. She saw a small office and assumed there was a small vision. She saw a quiet person and assumed there was a lack of ambition. But she finally understood that my approach had always been intentional. I was not trying to build something that impressed everyone. I was trying to build something that mattered. I told Claire that I understood why she had thought differently. We had grown in different environments and learned different definitions of achievement. Her success came from leading large teams and managing major responsibilities. My success came from solving problems, creating trust, and helping businesses become better. Neither path was wrong. We had simply forgotten to respect the differences between them. Claire smiled and said that the person she once worried about had become the person she admired most. I told her that admiration was not what I needed. What mattered was understanding. A relationship becomes stronger when people stop trying to measure each other and start supporting each other. A few days later, Richard officially announced a new strategic partnership between his company and my business. The announcement attracted attention from people who had never noticed my work before. But the attention itself did not change who I was. I was still the same person who worked quietly, listened carefully, and believed that real value did not need to be announced. Looking back, I realized that the biggest lesson was not about business success. It was about patience. People may misunderstand your choices. They may judge your progress before they understand your journey. But if you continue building with purpose, the truth eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The weeks after the partnership announcement brought a new kind of attention into my life. People who had never heard of my company before suddenly wanted to know more about the person behind the work. Invitations arrived, conversations changed, and some people who once ignored my ideas started asking for my opinion. But I quickly realized something important. Recognition can be temporary, but character is something you carry with you every day. I did not want to become someone who only felt valuable when others noticed him. I wanted to remain the same person who had built everything through patience, discipline, and consistency. At Richard Hayes' company, the focus remained on long-term improvement. The partnership was not about creating a short moment of success. It was about creating a stronger future. Teams continued working together more effectively. Leaders communicated more openly, and employees began feeling more connected to the direction of the organization. Richard often told me that the greatest change was not the strategy itself. It was the mindset behind it. The company had learned to look deeper before making decisions. They had learned that problems were not always caused by a lack of effort. Sometimes they were caused by people moving in different directions without realizing it. One morning, Richard asked me to join him during a meeting with several department leaders. He wanted them to hear directly from me about the principles behind the changes. I explained that every successful organization needed two things: a clear purpose and people who believe their work mattered. When employees understand why their efforts are important, they become more engaged and more willing to contribute ideas. The room was quiet as everyone listened. I noticed that many of them were thinking about their own experiences. They were not just hearing business advice. They were reflecting on how they worked with others. After the meeting, one of the managers approached me. He told me that before I joined the company, he thought the solution would require expensive technology or major restructuring. But he realized the real solution was improving communication and understanding between people. I appreciated his honesty because it reflected something I had learned many years earlier. The most complicated problems are not always solved with the most complicated answers. Sometimes the simplest changes create the biggest results. At home, Claire continued to grow in ways I never expected. She started sharing more about the pressure she experienced in her own career. Before, we often talked about achievements, deadlines, and responsibilities, but we rarely talked about the challenges behind them. She admitted that she had spent years trying to appear strong because she believed successful people always needed to have everything under control. I told her that strength did not mean pretending difficulties did not exist. Real strength came from being willing to learn, adapt, and ask for help when necessary. That conversation brought us closer than we had been in years. We were no longer comparing whose path was more successful. We were finally appreciating the effort behind each other's choices. One evening, Claire looked at me and said something I would never forget. She said that she had spent years looking for success in the places everyone told her to look, but she had missed the person beside her who had been building something meaningful all along. I smiled because I knew the moment was not about proving that she was wrong. It was about both of us understanding something we had forgotten. People are often more than what the world sees at first glance. And sometimes the greatest victories are not the moments when others finally recognize you. They are the moments when you no longer need their approval to know your own worth. As the partnership between my company and Richard Hayes' organization continued, I started noticing a change that had nothing to do with business numbers or professional recognition. The biggest transformation was happening in the way people approach challenges. The company was no longer searching for quick solutions. They were learning how to understand problems before trying to fix them. That shift created something more valuable than temporary success. It created confidence. Richard often reminded his leadership team that the strongest organizations were not built by avoiding difficulties. They were built by learning how to respond when difficulties appeared. I appreciated that perspective because it matched everything I had learned throughout my career. Every challenge carried a lesson, and every setback could reveal something that needed improvement. One afternoon, Richard invited me to a strategy session where the company was discussing future growth. The executives wanted to expand into new markets, but they wanted to make sure they were prepared. They asked for my thoughts about maintaining quality while increasing their reach. I explained that growth should never come at the cost of the values that created success in the first place. A company could increase revenue, attract more customers, and still lose its direction if it forgot the people behind those achievements. The leaders listened carefully as I shared my perspective. I explained that long-term success came from building strong systems, developing talented people, and creating an environment where ideas could be shared openly. After the meeting, Richard told me something that stayed with me. He said that when he first heard about me, he expected someone who would arrive with complicated strategies and try to impress everyone. Instead, he found someone who focused on understanding people first. I smiled because that had always been my approach. I never believed leadership was about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about helping others discover better answers. At home, Claire and I continued building a stronger relationship. The conversations between us became more honest and meaningful. We talked about our goals, our fears, and the expectations we had placed on ourselves. Claire admitted that she had spent many years believing she always needed to appear successful. She thought people respected confidence only when it was visible. But she started realizing that some of the strongest people she knew were not the ones demanding attention. They were the ones quietly creating results. I told her that I had also learned something from her. Her ambition and determination had inspired me in many ways. The problem was never that we were different. The problem was that we had stopped appreciating those differences. We had been comparing two different definitions of success instead of recognizing that both could exist together. A few months later, my company reached a new stage of growth. The opportunities that once seemed uncertain became reality. But even as things improved, I stayed focused on the same principles that guided me from the beginning. I continued listening, learning, and helping people solve meaningful problems. The attention that came afterward was never the reason I worked hard. It was simply a reminder that patience often reveals what people cannot see immediately. Claire and I eventually returned to the conversation that started everything. She told me she remembered saying that my business would never become what I hoped. She said she now understood why those words were wrong. Not because my business became successful, but because she had judged my journey without understanding it. I told her that everyone makes mistakes when they only see part of a story. What matters is having the courage to learn when the missing pieces become clear. Looking back, I realized that the greatest change was not that people finally recognized my abilities. The greatest change was that I no longer measured my value by whether they did. I had learned that true confidence comes from knowing who you are, even before the world recognizes it. Years after that first moment when I was told my business would never succeed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. The biggest lesson was not about proving someone wrong. It was about understanding that every person has a journey that others cannot fully see. At the beginning, people looked at my company and saw limitations. They saw a small operation, a quiet founder, and a path that did not match their expectations. But they did not see the years of preparation, the lessons from every challenge, and the relationships built through trust. Richard Hayes's company continued to grow stronger through the changes we created together. The partnership between our businesses became more than a professional arrangement. It became an example of what could happen when people were willing to look beyond assumptions and focus on real solutions. Richard often told me that the most valuable thing I brought to his organization was not a specific strategy or a single idea. It was a different way of thinking. I reminded people to slow down, ask better questions, and understand the reasons behind every challenge before searching for answers. Those principles became part of the company's culture. Employees became more confident sharing ideas. Leaders became more connected with their teams, and decisions became more thoughtful. The company was no longer only focused on immediate results. It was building something that could last. Claire and I also continued growing together. Our relationship changed because we stopped trying to prove which version of success was better. We started respecting that we had different strengths and different ways of approaching life. Claire remained a strong leader in her own career, but she began seeing success differently. She understood that a person's value was not determined by a title, a position, or the opinions of others. She learned that some of the most meaningful achievements happen quietly before anyone notices them. One evening, we sat together and talked about the years we had spent misunderstanding each other. Claire told me that she wished she had asked more questions instead of making assumptions. She said she had been so focused on measuring visible achievements that she missed the dedication happening right in front of her. I told her that I also had something to learn. I learned that even when people misunderstand you, communication still matters. Sometimes people cannot recognize your journey because you have never shared enough of it with them. That conversation helped us create a stronger connection than we had before. We were no longer two people trying to compare accomplishments. We were two people supporting each other's goals and appreciating the effort behind them. Looking back, I realized that the most important moment was not when a CEO recognized my abilities or when others started respecting my work. Those moments were meaningful, but they were not what defined my story. The real victory was learning to trust myself before anyone else did. There will always be people who judge your progress based on what they can see. They may not understand your decisions, your timing, or your vision. But that does not mean your journey has no value. Success is not always loud. It does not always arrive with attention or approval. Sometimes it is built quietly through discipline, patience, and the courage to continue when nobody else understands. The person others underestimated was never someone who needed to become valuable. He was already valuable. The only thing that changed was that people finally took the time to see it.